I'm Karen.
I'm June.
We've got about 25 minutes to just briefly say something about really going beyond the law, because I think it's something we've both been working around advocacy for about 20 years. That's why we get kind of called legends, because we have been worrying about this for quite a long time. So we want to sort of reflect on some of our experience and think about actually going beyond the law to think about rights. And we're going to start with you. We're going to have a bit of audience participation in a minute and have a bit of a reflective exercise. We're going to talk about the context for your advocacy practice. And then we want to reflect on advocacy as emancipatory practice, because that's where its roots were. That's where it came from. It came from the movement of mental health service users, of people with learning disabilities, of the disabled people's movements. And we're going to beg the question about actually, have we lost touch with those roots? We're then going to sort of look at the development of statutory advocacy and really pose some kind of challenges and opportunities for the future. So, June, some audience participation.
Okay, so reflective exercise time. Can you read that and think about someone you know in your role as an advocate, or somebody that you've advocated with or you have worked with in another professional capacity? Just bring that into your mind, and this is not going to be very long at all because we don't have a lot of time. And I'd like you to make a note in your mind of the needs of that person. Okay, have you been able to do that? Have I given you enough time to think of the needs of the person you've worked with, either as an advocate or in another professional capacity? So the next slide is actually to move on from that. I'd like you to think about, what about the rights of the person? So can you think what their rights might be? So we're looking at needs and we're looking at rights. You can see where this is going. So, hello?
Their right to respect.
Right, that's good.
Oh, come on, Rob. To believe.
Okay? That's
Right
good.
to respect
Right, respect.
and believe.
And believe.
Yeah,
Their beliefs.
To be believed.
Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So thank you for that. I know I said if you could think about it, but perhaps if you want to call out, I'll take maybe 4 or 5 different ideas. Thank you. Can you hear?
Yes, the right to live in their own home.
Right to live in their own home. Okay.
Right to a family life.
Right to family life. I think I'm recognising where the rights are coming from, absolutely.
The right to make an unwise decision.
Right to make what's considered unwise decisions. Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Same rights as me.
Right to...
Same rights as me.
Right to be...
Same rights as me.
Oh, right. Thank you. I wear hearing aids and I don't always hear, sorry. But you knew that from the earlier session I did as well. So the same rights, me as you as everyone else. Yeah? So we're good. So this is what's the difference then? What's the difference between the needs and the rights? Is there a difference?
There could be, couldn't there?
It could be.
It depends on, I suppose, it's looking at safety, but also the person's right to do something that you might think is unsafe, but they may not, and they may wish to do it, there's a story about this mother who, her daughter was dying, she was actually going to die, and she wanted to climb a mountain, not the mountain, what they call them, cliff, like a cliff thing.
Yeah.
She wanted to climb, and her mum knew that, she was going to die anyway, and her mum didn't want her to do it, but she let her do it because it's what she wanted to do. And I think, it's thinking about how we see things, isn't it? And it's very hard for parents, isn't it? Because parents will never stop being. I talked about this earlier on. Parents will never stop being parents until they're not here anymore.
Absolutely.
So,
and that can quite often be the way that professionals can also impact and take those rights away. And actually this so leads into the next
yeah,
slide.
but don't we have the right then to take them back and tell them to go and
Absolutely. Come and
take
go.
a long run off a short pier?
That's very well put. So we're going to look at the next slide. It's exactly what you've just said. So should we put that up? So how are you going to practice? You can practice with the lead on protection, which is what you're saying.
Yeah.
People with needs, seeing people with needs, seeing people as vulnerable, seeing people at risks. You can go on that side of the board, or you can work, your practice can work in
That's the better one.
as
isn't it?
empowerment.
Yeah. That's the better
Absolutely. So that we are citizens with rights and responsibilities, choice and control.
Yeah. Can I say something about choice? I like using the words informed choice.
That's very good, yeah.
Because for the simple reason,
Yeah.
when I wanted to learn to drive, I had to know that there's responsibilities
And
around
responsibilities
that,
too, yeah.
And as a person with a learning disability,
So there you've got the word responsibility, so you're
Yeah.
informed about that.
Okay.
So Karen's going to take that, and thank you, that really led well into it.
Yes, so one of the other things that we often ask people to do is to actually locate their practice on that kind of spectrum. Because the way in which we think about what we do, whether, those aren't either or, services, advocacy practice will be somewhere in the middle. And thinking about where your advocacy practice is located on that spectrum, I think is your sort of homework. But we really have, over the last 20 years, been reflecting on advocacy as essentially an emancipatory practice. And we'll talk a bit about the kind of challenges that advocacy faces in a minute, because obviously services often, and they're trying to move towards more approaches that recognise people's strengths and assets, but actually they've often been preoccupied with people's needs and the risks, and those are the things that grab media attention. But we want to kind of dig that down a bit further, because in terms of emancipatory practice, so if you think of advocacy as a mechanism for social justice, which is the way I think about it, you can distinguish advocacy as enabling people to have a voice. And having a voice, as we all know, is really important because it enables people to express their needs, their wishes and preferences. But it's not enough. It's not enough. And if advocacy practice is limited to enabling people to have a voice, I think it's really missing something. So we would argue that actually advocacy also has to be meaning-driven. It has to think about and enable healthcare professionals, social care professionals to understand the meaning of the experience for people that are using their kind of services. And we'll give you some examples of that. So clearly, this is often where we position advocacy, about enabling people to be heard. And these are some examples that come from our own research, where people who use services have talked to us about ways in which their views have been dismissed. So, something as simple as not providing interpreting services, people being assumed, this is particularly important, I think, when there are issues to do with capacity, or people maybe with mental health issues where views get dismissed. Assumptions about people's level of literacy, and capacity to participate. You can read for yourselves, but the kind of contrast to that, the going deeper, I think, in terms of the ways in which people's experience gets profoundly misunderstood, is when the meaning of that experience is not recognised or understood. So providing an advocacy service that has an equal opportunities policy with no understanding of the meaning of being an African Caribbean man who's at risk of being detained in secure services it's not enough just to think we can give, support someone to have a voice if you have no meaning as a service of what that might be like. So the ways in which people's meaning is not recognised is that actually normal experiences get framed in a particular way. So they might get framed as mental illness, they might get framed as kind of something to do with kind of fixing the person, and the stigma and discrimination and social disadvantage that people experience in their life actually is unchallenged. But also, and I unfortunately missed the only slot on diversity on this programme, the slot on LGBTQ session, but that's a really good example of how normative assumptions actually both drive professional practice, but can also drive the practice of advocates. We won't go into this a bit, but we just wanted to say that actually, because we're going to talk a bit about some of the challenges and opportunities facing statutory advocacy, there's a lot of different forms of advocacy, and some of these differ in really important ways because they're all about giving people a voice, a sense of sort of solidarity and feeling of not being alone. But we think, and we would argue, that they differ profoundly in the extent to which the meaning of people's experience is understood. And again, another bit of takeaway homework, that actually the, thinking about your own service in terms of whether it's kind of purely voice-driven or whether actually it's creating that space for richer and diverse and multiple meanings to be surfaced. So clearly one way of navigating this difficult territory is to reframe advocacy in terms of rights, because the law in a sense is a bit of a kind of default position, and I think you're very kind of concerned with the law and what it says. But reframing advocacy in terms of rights, I think, picks up the point actually that was made over here, that people have under these different conventions exactly the same rights, and that gives, I think, a real strong underpinning to advocacy as emancipatory practice. But where are we in the development of statutory advocacy? Well, our observations would be that it has become increasingly professionalised. There's lots of training, there's entry requirements, there's accreditation, and I think there's increasingly, and this is a challenge I think to you all out there, because it's important that you know about the law, but there's become a preoccupation with the kind of legalities. I'd rather see a preoccupation with actually how can we really be promoting and supporting people to self-advocate. Interestingly, I haven't had any questions about that over the last year, but these are a couple of questions that landed in my inbox. So should an advocate under the Care Act be involved at the point a care plan is reviewed, or whether this is restricted to once a revision is required? And similarly, a question about Section 117. I wonder if we're in danger of missing the point. It's a bit like when I shared an office with somebody who got very exercised about who should pay for a bath for somebody. Was it a health bath or a social care bath? It was a bath. I think advocacy is in danger of actually going down the same route. Is this person eligible for something just because this is what it says in our commissioning contract? And I speak as somebody who has commissioned advocacy services. In terms of the framing then, The framing becomes issue-based, it's time-limited, and clearly advocacy, like all sectors, is affected by austerity, by this contract culture that we've got and variable understanding of commissioners of what advocacy actually is. And the outcome measurement is often very limited, so it might be limited to whether or not somebody's issue has been resolved. And all of that, I think, serves to pull statutory advocacy and advocacy away from actually this rights-based emancipatory practice.
So we begin to look at the challenges, and we'll carry on looking at some challenges only briefly, and I'm asking you to think about these things. A lot of the things we've said, please take away, do it as homework, because again, time is against us. So there are three main challenges as we see it.
Oh, sorry.
Right, okay. So three main challenges which really bring together what we've been talking about. So how do you go beyond the law to sustain core advocacy principles and work within a framework of people as citizens? How can we keep that to a forefront? Commissioning and service context is driving the meaning of advocacy as protection. So risks, needs, vulnerabilities. How do we help to develop a different way of thinking along with these things? And I think being clear about the purpose of advocacy and its relationship to rights. So what we're talking about is not easy. It's not easy. It came from a place of rights, social movements. That's where it started, with us as service users, people who use services, whatever you want to. Well, I define as service user, but it got, it got colonised, it got hijacked, and it became more about the statutory requirements. We need to protect people who are vulnerable, and we must meet their needs. Not saying that's not right, but you also need to look at me and my rights when I needed advocacy. So being clear about the purpose of advocacy and its relationship to rights. So, I would challenge you to look for opportunities to locate advocacy as empowerment. So, beyond all the restrictions you have on your advocacy contracts, can you work with looking at how it becomes empowering your practice? So the key opportunities to locate advocacy is empowerment. We looked at the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Connect with and involve grassroots movements. That is so important. You need to have people with experience informing you, and you connect with people who use services, their organisations. When we did the research, we found that we found there was a challenge to organisations to actually engage proactively with diverse communities. So that was one of our recommendations, that it needs to be developed. And confidence of advocates and advocacy services to frame advocacy as empowerment and in terms of rights. I've always thought, as a service user, mental health service user, that when I was receiving services very actively, that my rights were not even heard, were not listened to. I go through the hospital door, the ward, and it was like any rights were left outside that door. I didn't have the respect of the services to actually think of me as a person with those rights. So it's like, what do you mean you're a citizen and you've got rights? Now, if I was well enough to argue it, I would have. But I do argue it now. So that to me is important. And this is a concluding, really good, we think, a quote from a commissioner. We did some research after the MR research we did research for commissioning of Care Act advocacy. And one of the responses we thought was really telling, and this person said, it's not just about the law. We call it social care and community advocacy. it's difficult to define, but if someone needs an advocate, they get it. So it's having a really broad, holistic view. What are the needs of the person for advocacy? Not necessarily the risks and vulnerabilities, but actually, I'm not going to box this as you know, Care Act advocacy or whatever it is, and therefore you can't get it if you're not. No, they have a different approach.